In Washington, D.C., the United States Supreme Court honors history's greatest lawgivers. Among them, standing beside Moses and Solon, is a figure you might not expect: Confucius, the ancient Chinese philosopher. The court's grand building itself was designed by architect Cass Gilbert and completed in 1935, a temple-like structure meant to embody the ideals of justice. But why is Confucius here, carved into America's highest court of justice? Who was this man, born 2,500 years ago in a small Chinese state, whose ideas would shape civilizations across the world? In this video, we explore the life, teachings, and legacy of Confucius, and why his wisdom still matters today. Before we dive into his life, let's talk about his name, because even that tells a story. His family name was Kong, and his given name Qiu literally means hill. At his coming-of-age ceremony, he received a courtesy name, Zhongni, which meant he was the second son in the family. So where does Confucius come from? That's the Latinized version of Confuzi, or Master Kong, a title of respect given by his students. Jesuit missionaries in the 16th century introduced this version to the West, and it stuck. But Confucius wasn't just a name in history books. He became the symbol of wisdom across East Asia. His teachings about virtue, justice, family loyalty, and treating others the way you wish to be treated shaped not only Chinese civilization, but the cultural DNA of the entire region. Even today, his ideas echo in classrooms, courts, and families around the world. Confucius was born in 551 BCE in the small town of Zhouyi, near today's Chirfu in Shandong, China. At that same time in the West, the philosopher Pythagoras was teaching in Greece, and the Persian Empire was beginning its rise. Confucius's father, an aging military officer, died when the boy was only 3. Raised in poverty by his mother, he grew up in a world of political chaos and moral decline. Yet he devoted himself to study, history, music, ritual, and the 6 arts, hoping that knowledge could rebuild what war and corruption had torn apart. At 19, Confucius married and soon became a father. To support his family and to honor his late mother with a proper burial, he worked as a bookkeeper, a stable manager, and even cared for sheep and horses. These humble jobs gave him a unique understanding of both ordinary life and the responsibilities of rulers. By his early 20s, Confucius had begun to teach. Around this time in Greece, city-states like Athens were experimenting with early democracy. While in China, Confucius's reputation grew not through wealth or force, but through wisdom. By 501 BCE, he had entered government service in his home state of Lu, eventually becoming Minister of Crime. He tried to reform society through virtue and order, encouraging the dismantling of private city walls that symbolized clan power. But politics is never simple. Intrigue, rivalries, and even bribes of fine horses and dancing girls derailed his reforms. Disillusioned, Confucius left Ru in self-imposed exile. For over a decade, he and his disciples traveled across China to Wei, Song, Zheng, Chu, and others, offering rulers his vision of just governance. But his ideas were rarely implemented. Meanwhile, in the West, Socrates was still a child in Athens. The great age of Greek philosophy was only about to begin. At last, in his late 60s, Confucius returned home to Lu, where he spent his final years teaching. Tradition says he taught 3,000 students, with 72 mastering the 6 arts. He dedicated himself to preserving the wisdom of earlier ages, editing or transmitting texts later known as the 5 Classics. In 479 BCE, at the age of 71, Confucius passed away, nearly 70 years before Socrates would drink the hemlock in Athens. His tomb in Chirfu grew into a vast cemetery, today covering 180 hectares and honored as a World Heritage Site. A fitting tribute to a man whose humble life shaped the moral foundation of East Asia, while his Western contemporaries laid the groundwork for Greek philosophy. Confucius never saw himself as an inventor of new ideas. In the Analects, he described himself simply as a transmitter, carrying forward the wisdom of the ancients. The very first word in the Analects is study, 学, showing how deeply he valued learning. For him, education was not about memorizing facts, but about shaping character. He urged his students to master the classics. The Book of Odes reflected the hopes and sorrows of ordinary people. The spring and autumn annals connected present dilemmas to past events. And the Book of Changes explored how to act wisely in uncertain times. Through these works, he believed students could cultivate themselves and help restore harmony to society. Unlike many religious teachers, Confucius rarely spoke about the afterlife or the soul. In this sense, he was closer to a humanist than a spiritualist. Much like the Greek philosophers of his time, Pythagoras and later Socrates, his focus was on how to live a virtuous life here and now. One of his most famous ideas is sometimes called the Silver Rule. Do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself. In the West, the Christian tradition would later frame this positively as the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Different in form, but both point to empathy and reciprocity as the foundation of morality. Confucius's ethics centered on three concepts: li, yi, and run. Li, ritual and proper conduct, not just ceremonies, but everyday habits that shape social order. Yi, righteousness, doing what is right, not just what is profitable. Run, humaneness or benevolence, empathy and kindness in our responsibilities to others. To live by these was to become a junzi, or superior person, not because of birth, but because of moral character. In this, Confucius can be compared to Socrates, where Socrates used constant questioning to guide people toward truth. Confucius used personal example and tradition to guide people toward virtue. Both saw philosophy as a way of life, not just abstract theory. Politics for Confucius flowed from ethics. If you lead people with laws, they will avoid punishment, but feel no shame. If you lead them with virtue, they will develop a sense of shame and become good. His vision of government, based on moral authority rather than coercion, stands in contrast to legalism in China and also recalls Plato's later idea of the philosopher king in Greece. Finally, Confucius saw music and poetry as tools for cultivating the heart. Music moves us within, rites guide us from without, he said. For him, music created inner harmony, while ritual created social order. Together, they aligned humanity with heaven and earth. Just as the Greeks believed music shaped the soul, Confucius saw it as essential to education and virtue. In short, Confucius's philosophy was about shaping people from the inside out, cultivating character, empathy, and responsibility, with the goal of creating a just and harmonious society. His ideas, though born in ancient China, stand alongside those of his Western contemporaries, as part of the world's shared search for wisdom. When Confucius died in 479 BCE, his voice might have seemed to fade into silence, but his disciples carried on his mission. They collected his sayings into the Analects, a work that, like Plato's dialogues of Socrates, preserved the teachings of a master for generations to come. In fact, Confucius died almost 70 years before Socrates, and yet both would later stand as giants of ethical philosophy. In East and West, in the 4th century BCE, while Aristotle was tutoring Alexander the Great in Greece, the Confucian thinker Mengzi taught that human nature is inherently good. A century later, as Rome was rising on the Mediterranean, Xuanzi argued the opposite. that human nature is selfish and requires discipline to cultivate virtue. Together with the Analects, their writings became the foundation of Confucian philosophy. In 221 BCE, as Hannibal's Carthage threatened Rome, the Qin dynasty unified China under a harsh system of legalism, rejecting Confucian ideals. Books were burned, scholars silenced. But the Qin collapsed within a generation. Under the Han dynasty, by 140 BCE, at the same time Rome was expanding into a Mediterranean empire, Emperor Han Wudi made Confucianism the state philosophy. From then on, studying Confucius became the gateway to government service, a system that endured for nearly 2,000 years. By the Song dynasty in the 12th century, while medieval Europe was building Gothic cathedrals, Chinese scholars such as Zhu Xi revitalized Confucianism in a movement called Neo-Confucianism. This version blended Confucian ethics with elements of Buddhism and Taoism and spread across Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. By the 16th and 17th centuries, during Europe's Renaissance and the age of Galileo and Descartes, Jesuit missionaries translated Confucius's works into Latin and French. To Enlightenment thinkers, he appeared as an Eastern counterpart to Socrates, a philosopher who taught a morality based on reason, virtue, and human relationships, rather than divine revelation. Over the centuries, Confucian values shaped family life, education, and government across East Asia. They influenced emperors, scholars, and reformers. Even today, his legacy sparks debate. Is Confucianism a religion, a philosophy, or simply a guide to living with dignity and responsibility? What is certain is this: Confucius's legacy has outlived dynasties, crossed borders, and stood shoulder to shoulder with the greatest traditions of world thought, from Greece and Rome to modern Europe. His words, spoken to a circle of disciples in ancient China, became part of humanity's shared search for wisdom. Over time, Confucius's thought became one of the most enduring traditions in world history. Across East Asia, from Korea to Japan to Vietnam, his teachings shaped schools, family life, and government. For centuries, students memorized his words to prepare for civil service, making Confucianism a daily guide to life. In the 17th century, Jesuit missionaries brought his works to Europe. Philosophers like Voltaire and Leibniz admired him as a humanist, who grounded morality in reason and virtue. To them, Confucius was not exotic, but universal, a teacher whose lessons could speak across cultures, just like Socrates or Cicero. From ancient China to Enlightenment Europe to the present day, Confucius's call for virtue, harmony, and learning has never stopped traveling, sometimes inspiring, sometimes provoking, but always relevant. Confucius's journey to America began in Europe. In 1687, Jesuit missionaries published Confucius, the Philosopher of the Chinese in Paris, introducing his life and classics like The Great Learning, The Doctrine of the Mean, and the Analects. English versions soon followed. By the early 1700s, his name appeared in colonial newspapers. In 1733, a library in Philadelphia, later used by Benjamin Franklin, held a copy of the Jesuit book. Between 1737 and 1743, Franklin printed excerpts of Confucian texts in his newspapers. For him, as for Confucius, social reform began with leaders setting a moral example. By 1794, Confucius was familiar enough that an anonymous writer signed a political article, Confucius, condemning lawmakers for selling public land without citizens' consent. The debate raged for months. Early Americans even compared George Washington to Confucius, praising his virtue and restraint. John Quincy Adams was likewise admired for his Confucian qualities of integrity and discipline. For the Founding Fathers, Confucius was not foreign. He stood alongside Socrates, Cicero, and the Bible, as part of a universal tradition of wisdom. In the New Republic, Confucius's message was clear. True authority comes not from force, but from virtue. If you walk around the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., and look up at the East Pediment, you'll see three lawgivers carved in stone: Moses in the center, Solon of Athens on one side, and Confucius on the other. This sculpture was created in the 1930s by Herman A. McNeil, working with architect Cass Gilbert. The motto beneath reads, "Justice the guardian of liberty." McNeil explained that American law did not appear out of nowhere. It was inherited from earlier civilizations. That's why he placed Hebrew, Greek, and Chinese wisdom side by side. Around the central trio are figures representing justice, mercy, and the duties of the court. Interestingly, this pediment is not on the front steps that tourists usually see, but on the back, facing the Library of Congress. Inside the courtroom, the theme continues. Marble friezes show 18 great lawmakers of history, Confucius among them. By the 1930s, Confucius was already well known in the West. Jesuit translations, Enlightenment admiration, and even Franklin's newspaper excerpts had long made him part of global conversation. So when America's highest court was built, it was natural to honor him as a teacher of order and virtue. Confucius appears here not as a token Chinese figure, but as one of the world's great voices of law and ethics. His presence reminds us that justice in America and anywhere is strongest when it draws from the wisdom of many civilizations. Confucius's influence is not only found in books and ideas. It also lives on his family. After his death in 479 BCE, he was buried in Siufu, his hometown. Over the centuries, his descendants guarded his tomb, which grew into a vast cemetery known as the Kong Forest. Today, this site covers hundreds of acres and holds more than 100,000 graves. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a place where history feels alive. Chinese emperors gave the family a special hereditary title, Duke, for perpetuating the sage. For nearly 2,000 years, the Kong family held a status second only to the imperial household. They were living symbols of continuity, reminding each generation of the values Confucius taught. Even more remarkable is the family tree itself. The genealogy of Confucius is the longest recorded lineage in the world, carefully updated for over 70 generations. Today, millions of people across China and beyond trace their roots back to Confucius. Some of his direct descendants still live in Siufu, while others have moved around the globe. So when we talk about Confucius's legacy, it is more than philosophy. It is a living heritage carried by both ideas and people. A reminder that the search for wisdom can be passed not only through words, but through generations of life itself. From the dusty roads of ancient China to the marble walls of the U.S. Supreme Court, the journey of Confucius has been long and extraordinary. He lived more than 2,500 years ago, in a time of war and uncertainty. Yet his answer was not weapons or power, but wisdom, study, virtue, and harmony. His disciples kept his words alive. His ideas shaped kingdoms, inspired emperors, guided families, and trained generations of scholars. They crossed into Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, traveled through Europe, influenced Enlightenment thinkers, and even reached the birth of America. Today, Confucius is remembered in many ways. As a philosopher, a teacher, a critic of power, and a guide to moral life. Some debate whether his thought is a religion or a philosophy. But perhaps it is simpler than that. Confucius teaches us how to live with dignity, how to respect others, and how to lead by example. His legacy survives in books, in global traditions, and even in his own family line, the longest in history. More than anything, it survives in the timeless search for wisdom that unites people across cultures. Confucius once said, "Do not do to others what you do not want done to yourself." Across centuries and civilizations, that message still speaks, reminding us that true greatness lies not in power, but in humanity.